But what I am going to talk about first is just a review of the national evidence. And some of this comes from my work. A lot of it comes from the work of many economists. This has become a hot issue in economics because it turns out that the supply of housing is a major economic issue in this country and in other countries as well. So when you look at land use regulation that increases the cost of developing housing or makes it more difficult to build housing, that reduces the supply of housing. So in a simple supply and demand framework, you'd expect, well, if you reduce the supply, the price is going to go up, at least if demand is growing. And so we see that. We see that the more intense is land use regulation on new housing, the more expensive is new housing, and that drives workers away. It can be a benefit to incumbent homeowners, right? So if you're a homeowner and you see that no one else can build a house, the value of your house is going to go up. So there's a tension here between the interest of the people who already live there and the interest of the people who would like to move in, as well as businesses that would like to recruit those new residents. Residential land use regulation, according to the evidence, reduces our prosperity significantly. One common estimate shows that US GDP is 10% lower than it would be even if you just moved the most stringently regulated jurisdictions in the country to just an average level of regulation on new housing. US GDP would be 10% higher. That's a really significant difference. There's also a lot of evidence from places like Massachusetts that shows that residential land use regulation does not reduce the property tax burden. This is one of the justifications for it. People who support limiting new housing will say that that's necessary to make sure that we don't get kids in schools or things like that. But there's a large and growing body of evidence that these regulations may actually increase the property tax burden by making it seem as if the tax burden is falling when it really isn't, because what you're doing is you're driving up the value of housing. And as we know in New Hampshire, when you drive up that assessed value, you can raise the same revenue on a lower tax rate. So your tax rate seems to be falling, but the actual amount that you're paying every year may even be going up. There's substantial evidence that restrictive land use regulation increases racial and socioeconomic segregation. Jonathan Rothwell, who we worked with at the center, he's now the principal economist at Gallup. He's done a lot of research on this, and he finds that in the more regulated metro areas, you see more of this racial and socioeconomic segregation. You also see greater achievement gaps among school kids in those metro areas compared to the ones that are less regulated. And so the reason for this is that places with the better public schools can be very expensive to get into when they regulate the supply of new housing. In places that don't regulate the supply of new housing, families can easily move to districts that have better schools, and you get less of that inequality across socioeconomic levels in their ability to get their kids a good education. So lots of negative macro level consequences of limiting the supply of housing.